Hello, my friends. I thought I would bring you along with me today while I repair the crotch of my favorite jeans. As you can see, I've actually repaired them before. I did some machine embroidery on them quite a while ago in order to repair the holes that are in the crotch. And these are super easy to take apart. They don't have a hem at the bottom, so if you have a hem at the bottom, you'll need to open that up, but this one does not have a hem. So I'm going to pull out my favorite seam rippers. I have three options here: razor blade, traditional seam ripper, and a Havel's scalpel seam ripper. You can use one or all, just make sure they're sharp and make sure you're extra careful when you're using them. So we're going to start with the surged seam, and this is a seam that I actually did because again, I've repaired this before, so you can see those repairs from the inside. That's some stabilizer that I had used, and you can see where that repair has failed pretty catastrophically. So we're going to start by taking out the surged seam. The Havel's is especially good for that. I'll put a link in the description for that. I'm just going to rip some of those seams out, and honestly, it slices through it like butter once you get going. Sometimes it's hard to get started, but once you get going, it really goes. And so I'm going to just kind of work in sections. So I'm going to take out the surged edge first and just pick out those little stitches. The most tedious part of this entire process is taking out this seam line in the crotch seam. So your inseam is going to have your serging and your sturdier denim stitching. Since I did this myself, this is actually just traditional piecing thread. I probably used just a cotton piecing thread when I did this. When I repair this, we're going to go ahead and use an upholstery thread just because I want a stronger thread for the seam allowance. So you can see me kind of going back and forth trying different seam rippers to see what's going to work. And my trusty little purple seam ripper there. This is actually a new one. I will put, again, links in the descriptions for these. I bought tons of these from Hip Stitch in New Mexico, and I love these tiny seam rippers. So I'm just kind of going back and forth, again, just seeing what works best. And once I figure out which tool is working for me, then I will just go forward with that. But you use whatever you have, whatever makes sense. Again, just be extra careful if you're using the razor blade or the scalpel. Now we're just going to go ahead and take all the rest of that out, and I'm not going to make you watch. So we've got it all taken apart now, and you can see that because that seam line has been there for so long, it's a little bit folded. I still need to take off some thread, which a lint roller is really great for that. So if you just want to get that thread off there really quickly, you can certainly just pull it off, but if you just roll a lint roller, it will take most of that off, and then you won't have to worry about it later. So now you can really see where that hole is because it is just wide open. So the next thing we need to do is open up the back seam. We're going to need to go far enough in that we can actually access that fabric. And I am going to use the Havel's on this part because this is heavier stitching and it's just easier for me to use. So this back seam is actually a flat felled seam, and I'm going to be careful when I'm cutting this to make sure that I can get the stitching out without damaging the fabric, because I would like to put it back the way it is now. So I want to be able to, some of this fabric is going to be replaced obviously, but I still want to make sure that I am careful with the tools. I don't want to cut myself. I don't want to make the fabric any more damaged than it already is. Once you get that little bar tack out at the end, that is going to be the more difficult part. And you can see it wasn't really that hard. Once I got that pulled out, the rest is pretty easy peasy. Fun little story for you guys. When I first started sewing, I used a razor blade almost exclusively as a seam ripper, and it wasn't until years later that I learned about a scalpel seam ripper and some of the other tools that were out there. So now we have those front and back seams open so that we can start working with that fabric. We've loosened it up. The edges are now raw, so I can go ahead and iron those little seams down so that they are flat. Line our raw edges. We're going to make sure that they are as straight as possible, as even as possible, because we want to use these as a template. I put a little piece of masking tape in the tear so that that will just be stable while we're using this piece for just recreation purposes. It will essentially become our pattern piece. So I'm going to use one of my rulers here to make a line as straight as possible that will leave me seam allowance, but will also give me the ability to cut away the damaged part of the fabric. This is actually the stitching line, and just a note, I don't normally use a Sharpie on fabric, but I wanted you to be able to see it, so I went ahead and did that, and I was able to get it out later, and I'll show you how at the end of the video. So I'm just making sure that line is nice and straight, and that will be our sewing line. So we're going to need to recreate that on the other side. So the way I like to do that is just using my pins to make a line. So I'll just pop my little pins in there. We'll line them up on our, what is our sewing line, the red line. And that'll just give us a really easy way to transfer and have the same exact line on the opposite side. Now we're flipping it over, and you can see the shiny little pins there. I'm going to use my ruler again, get it nice and lined up. And you can tell there's some stretching in the crotch. I mean, this is why they blew out. But we're just going to work around that, and it'll work out just fine. So we're going to line that up and go ahead and make another line. Now, I would recommend doing this with a non-permanent marker or chalk, like a Chaco, or you could use any marking thing that you like to use. You could even use like a piece of masking tape, works really well. I've done that before. That actually helps you skip a step, which we're going to talk about next. We'll just pop those pins out, and then we are ready to go to the next step. So now that we have that stitching line in place, we need a cutting line that is about 3/4 of an inch. I say about, it's going to be exactly 3/4 of an inch. That gives us plenty of fabric to make a flat felled seam, which we will be doing on these pieces in order for them to be flat and not rub against our thighs. So I'm just doing a little dotted line here so I have somewhere to line up my fabric. And I will repeat on the other side. And then once I'm done with the back crotch pieces, I will flip it over and do exactly the same thing on the front crotch pieces. I apologize for the camera going in and out of focus here. The camera really liked the reflection in my ruler. Next up, we're just going to go ahead and repeat on the front of the jeans. Lines drawn, it's time to go ahead and repair these jeans. So I have a leg from a pair of thrifted jeans that cost me about $4, and you can see that my jeans are just a little bit stretchy. They have, I think, something like 1% spandex, and these have a little more spandex, but I'm thinking for a crotch repair, that's not a terrible thing. So I'm going to go ahead and square this leg up, and I did make sure it was a little bit longer than what I needed for my fabric repair. And I do have 2 of these, so that gives me 4 pieces of fabric to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that 3/4 of an inch line on this piece of fabric, and that is how I'm going to line this up, and that's where I will sew. That gives me just a line to follow when I take this to my machine. So I'm going to line that up with the dotted line, and then I'm going to go ahead and pin that. Now, if you used a piece of uh, masking tape here, you would line it up with the outer edge of the masking tape, so the masking tape will be completely underneath your patch. And that is a perfectly acceptable way to do this too. I've done that a couple of times. The downside to that is occasionally you sew over the tape and then you have to pick that out. So I just, on balance, would prefer to have a line drawn. So we're going to go ahead and stitch that line down, and I'll show you what that looks like. I apologize for the super duper close-ups of my hands. I had a really hard time getting my camera angle right for this. I have utmost respect for people who do tutorials all the time and sew a little bit more clearly in their videos. So I have a little aftermarket laser light on my machine, and I just find that it makes it really easy to sew long lines. So I used it to line up with my stitching line that I drew previously. And I just took my time. Again, I'm using upholstery thread, and I thought that would just be a little sturdier for a jeans crotch. It's also something I had on hand, and I was doing this repair without any purchased products. So now we're going to pop those pins out, and the fun begins. You can see that we have covered our seam. We're going to go ahead and do a top stitch there, and there's that top stitch all done. It just helps it lie flat on top of those jeans. Now we're going to flip that over and get that nice and smooth, because now it's time to use our template. So we're going to use our blown out piece of fabric as the template. We're just going to cut right around it. Again, these are a little stretched out, but I just smoothed it down and did the best I could, and I'm hoping that extra spandex and the new pieces will be really helpful. So now we can go ahead and cut away our damaged piece of the original fabric. Pop that little extra piece of tape off. And there goes that damaged piece. So next we're going to trim off the new piece of fabric, the extra from the inside, because we're going to do a flat felled seam here. And that is just so that we don't have raw or serged edges chafing our thighs. So I'm going to roll that under. So that's the outside piece of fabric that I did not cut. We're going to roll that under. And there's a little damage from the hole right there, but it doesn't really matter because it doesn't go into the seam line. So I'm not super worried about it just poking out a little bit right there. We'll just sew right over that. I don't normally pin this, but I thought I would do it just for demonstration so you guys could see what it looks like, what it's supposed to look like while you're sewing. So I'm going to go ahead and just pin that down for you guys, and then we will take it over to the sewing machine and we will stitch that down. Now we're over at this machine. Again, I apologize for the giant hands. I will work on my camera angle for the next tutorial. So we're just going to get that going, and I am using a denim needle here. I don't know if I mentioned that previously, but I am using a denim weight needle, and we're just going to make sure we tack at the front and the back, or I should say the beginning and the end. And I'm just going to top stitch right down that rolled seam so that we get that nice flat felled seam. I don't like to sew over my pins, so I do remove those as I go if I'm using them. As I said before, I don't often use them when I'm doing this, but you know, it does make it a little bit easier to fold that in advance. So there we go. So now we have our little flat felled seam, so that means that's a finished edge on the inside of that repair. And we're going to turn around and we're going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. Now I'm leaving this in because I accidentally cut my piece of fabric off before I had trimmed the outside repair fabric. So I just taped it back on with masking tape, and I figure sometimes mistakes happen and we just got to swerve. So again, we're repeating what we did before. I've already sewn on this piece of repair fabric, and now I'm cutting away the excess using the old fabric as a template, and then I'm just going to take this masking tape off. And you can see I have trimmed off here. I trimmed off the opposite side to what we did on the other side of these jeans, so that when we sew that crotch seam together, those seams will nest. So last time I cut off some of the new fabric, this time I cut off the seam allowance of the old fabric, and we're pressing it the opposite direction. We're gonna top stitch that on the other side, and it will help that lie flatter inside of that crotch seam. Again, just pinning this down so that it is easier to handle and so that you guys can see what it looks like. And we're all done. I sewed that down. It was top stitched and then it was flat felled. And so I have that repair completely done. And now we're just going to repeat for the other side, and then we'll be ready to put these back together again. I have repaired both sides, and now what I'm showing you is that flat felled seam and how those seams are opposite. I don't know if you can tell from here, but they are pressed and top stitched in the opposite direction, and now we're going to sew those crotch seams back together. So this is going to be our front seam, and I'm going to sew using the original sewing line. I apologize, the footage for that just did not work, so I don't have footage sewing that. So I sewed it back together, and then I serged that little bit so that I could fold that over, and I'm just following what was originally there. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to top stitch on both sides. We're going to move to the back of the jeans, and we're going to do one more flat felled seam, and that is going to be in this curved area. So I'm just going to cut away following the original seam and which side was, like which direction it's turned. And we're going to cut that inside away, and then we're going to turn the original fabric. We're going to find that original spot on the top of the seam where we start, just where we opened it up. We're going to turn that under, and it is a little bulky, so it might take you a minute to get it in there, but you can definitely get it in there. And so I get that bulk turned in, and we're going to pin that just to hold it in place. Again, that's optional, but you might find it easier just to use a pin. So we're going to get that pinned, and then we're going to go back, and for this one, we're going to sew down that flat felled seam, and then we're going to go back and stitch that second line of stitching that's on the left-hand side there. You can see where that thread is a little bit loose right there. We're going to sew both of those sides, so the open side and the closed side. So here we're doing the flat felled seam. Just take your time and work through that bulk, and it will work out just fine. And now we have our crotch flat felled seam. going to go ahead and go back and stitch over the original stitching line because this had 2 stitching lines. And my thread is beige, so if you had gold, it would show quite a bit better. But again, I was just using what I had on hand. And so I just used this beige upholstery thread to repair these pants. And there you have a one serged and sewn sideways, kind of flat felled, and then you have a flat felled seam. We're going to match our crotch seam allowance. And this is the fun part, guys. We're almost done. We're going to match that crotch seam allowance. And if we did line up our fronts and back pieces correctly while we were making our repairs, then they will be symmetrical on the front, and will match itself and the back will match itself. The idea is you want it to look intentional. You can make it wonky if you like, if you're looking to make that more of a statement, but you don't have to do it that way. I just like to make it symmetrical. So this I definitely like to pin. I always pin this because those original seams really want to curl, and I find it a little bit less tedious to stitch back together if I am pinning. So for this, we're going to stitch all the way across from the edge, the bottom hem, all the way to the other bottom hem. And you can see, there we go, it's all stitched. And then I'm going to take this to my serger, but you don't have to. You can zigzag or you can just leave it like that, but it will fray if you don't finish it somehow. Even just an extra straight line of stitching will help that last a little bit longer. And for those serged edges, the ends there, I just tied those off and cut them. You can also weave them in or use fray block or something like that. So here is our repaired crotch. It is now hole free. You can see the repair. It actually stands out a little more on camera than it does in real life. You can see where when you fold them, that you have your little repair there. This shows a little bit when I'm wearing them, but not actually a lot. The front doesn't show at all because it was so minor. So this that shows a little bit, and then this doesn't show at all when I'm wearing them. The front doesn't. So I did get some red Sharpie on there, as you can see, but I sprayed isopropyl alcohol on that, and then I just washed them as normal, and it came out. Again, I don't recommend putting Sharpie on fabric, but I did that just for the visual. And I figured these are so old and so well loved that it would be okay. And here's your before. And here's your after. Guys, thank you for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please let me know in comments. If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, and come back on Tuesday for my weekly vlog. I would love to see you. Have a great week, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.